The newsagents.
The wife of the newsreader Hugh Edwards has named him as the BBC presenter facing allegations.
Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group, was on board the private jet that crashed near Moscow.
Does anyone ever say, you know what, you've done a good job because everyone else has sat on their arse?
First of all, I'm calling time on the misuse of so-called 15-minute cities. What is sinister is the idea that local councils can decide how often you go to the shops.
You called ministers useless fuckpigs.
Unequivocally, Rwanda is a safe country.
Some of the voices from the last 6 months of 2023. The year that Penny Mordaunt told us to stand up and fight. The year that Mark Harper invented the sinister 15-minute city that was telling you when you could go shopping. Gillian Keegan, who told us how fucking good she was at her job. And Hugh Edwards suddenly disappeared from our screens. Welcome to the Newsagents.
The newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis. And obviously some hugely momentous foreign news as well in the last 6 months of this year, most notably what happened in Israel on October the 7th, the reaction to it, and the political uncertainty of what on earth comes next in terms of Gaza and the West Bank and a more secure, peaceful Middle East. But also Prigozhin, the moment where we thought there was going to be a coup against Vladimir Putin, and then he suddenly has a plane crash and dies. And Rwanda. Is anyone ever going to get on a plane to go to Rwanda as an asylum seeker rather than as a Home Secretary hoping to send asylum seekers to Rwanda?
So if you haven't listened to the last episode, you might want to do that first, because we take you from January right up till July of 2023. If you're with us now, we're starting our reflection of 2023 with July. And what an extraordinary busy month that was. We always make the mistake, don't we, of thinking we're going into the summer months, and then July is crazy. And for 1 week, the news cycle was entirely dominated by the story that was broken in The Sun about Hugh Edwards. And it was a story that the BBC then kind of joined in on. And it was a story that utterly disappeared from sight after that Friday and hasn't really been talked about or discussed since, 6 months later.
Well, there were so many things that were so complicated about the Hugh story that the BBC kind of went in with some gusto into reporting the story. I was not sure quite what they were reporting, because there was no suggestion that Hugh had behaved illegally. Maybe he had sent a couple of off-text messages. That's as far as we know. Maybe there is much more to it than meets the eye. Initially, it was an unnamed presenter, except everyone in Medialand knew pretty instantly that it was about Hugh. And then an inquiry is launched. Hugh is suspended. We hear that Hugh has been admitted to hospital. He's talked about his mental health beforehand. And since then, crickets. Not a sound. Not a whisper. Is this investigation still going on 6 months? Has there been a resolution? Have the BBC and Hugh Edwards come to a deal? We have no idea. And it has just disappeared from view altogether.
And John, you say about the kind of no suggestion of illegality. But the point was, right, at the beginning of the story, with the Sun's reporting, which has subsequently been found to be quite shaky, let's put it that way, and certainly putting emphasis on things that, in retrospect, would they put emphasis on? The initial suggestion was there could have been something illegal. Then that was rowed back on. And I think it is one of those stories. I mean, you're right. It was kind of like a hurricane. It came into town. It blew everything away. It dominated the news cycle. And then there was nothing. But we do know that, like hurricanes, they have consequences. And in this case, we've got someone's career, someone's life. And as you say, John, maybe there is more to it. But the fact that it's one of those occasions where you can understand why sometimes people say the press and the media are always holding others to account, or always saying how important accountability is. Where's the accountability here? Because something came along, dominated the news cycle, and then just went away and left a trail of destruction in its path for the individuals concerned.
Another hurricane of July was one Nigel Farage, who I think developed into a theme of 2023. But this particular hurricane came when he started a campaign against Coutts Bank, you know, sort of posh bank Coutts, for threatening to close his accounts without explanation. And it was a very interesting sort of eruption, this one, because at first it looked as if it was politically motivated, and Farage managed to get them to release documents that saw the bank calling him out for xenophobic views and racist views. So Farage thought he had a case against Coutts. Then it got very murky because a story was broken by a business journalist at the BBC in which Coutts' chief executive named Farage, and that brought her down, and that then lost her standing with the bank and her pension and her salary. And actually, the ultimate report into what had happened at Coutts found that Farage hadn't lost his account because of his political motivation. It didn't deny they'd been looking into his politics, but it suggested it was because his banking had reached a lower threshold than a Coutts account would allow. Nigel Farage contests that and says, oh, they never actually got to my bit in it. And they will say, well, that's because actually we didn't shut your account. So his account was never closed. But I would say this was never about a Coutts bank account. This was about Nigel Farage wanting to find a new platform, one that maybe the people would understand, which was about being shut down, being censored, having your voice cut off by, Coutts, the elites. And this began his pathway back to the centre of British politics.
If you were listening to our earlier episode, for the first 6 months of this year, we talked about Donald Trump's court appearance and how Donald Trump learned very quickly how to weaponise a court appearance to his absolute advantage. And here we have a story potentially embarrassing for Nigel Farage. And I hold my hand up. I massively took the piss out of Nigel Farage, not being rich enough to have a Coutts account. There was something in that report which talked about his political views and unacceptability. So I said sorry about that bit. But then we got a voice note from Mr. Farage himself to the newsagents.
Hello, newsagents. It's Nigel Farage here. I want to say a big, mega thank you to John Sopel. John, it wasn't your fault that the guy at the BBC who put the story out that my account at Coutts had been closed because I didn't have enough money, wasn't your fault that the guy that put it out had been for dinner and sat the night before next to Dame Alison Rose, the boss of NatWest. Is it any coincidence that we got that spin? But John, I fully accept your apology. I really genuinely do, and thank you.
Yeah, I think Emily's spot on in the centrality of this story to kind of how the year came to unfold, because it was the moment where Farage began what I think could yet become a full re-immersion, a full re-entry into British politics. And the whole story once again illustrated the continuing hold, indeed if not thrall, that the Conservative Party and the very top of the Conservative Party, even under Rishi Sunak, continues to be in with regards to him. Because you had this situation where, when the facts were, and indeed I think still are, quite murky, you had a situation where the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Chair of the Conservative Party, virtually every cabinet minister, all of the kind of echelons of the Conservative press and Conservative kind of media ecosystem, all basically getting in behind a campaign, this idea of kind of political persecution. It's like the bloody Dreyfus affair or something.
To your point, Lewis, Jeremy Hunt at the Tory Party conference, more on which later, created a new policy about debanking, based on something that was so flimsy that was never really about political debanking, which may exist. And I think that speaks to you. They all rode in behind a man they are getting increasingly scared of again.
Exactly. One of the dynamics at play now is that the CCHQ are terrified that Farage makes either a full or quasi-full re-entry into British politics before the general election with reform, and that they're going to get dragged all over the place. Because Farage is, something we're going to talk about a bit later, eyeing the kind of this new wave of kind of populist right-wing parties making a re-entry into different countries' political scene, and is thinking, who would like a bit of that? Maybe I would like a bit of that.
Let's go to August now, because there was a very notable death. Someone died in a plane crash, which mysteriously was caused by a hand grenade going off inside the plane, I think.
Happens all the time.
Happens all the time. Yevgeny Prigozhin became this figure for a fleeting moment who we thought was going to bring about a coup that would lead to the deposing of Vladimir Putin, that his military group, the Wagner group, this group of mercenaries that were very well equipped, very well manned, were going to march on Moscow an overthrow. It was the most unbelievable moment.
They were marching on Moscow. I mean, there was that moment in the July where there was this enormous column that was heading to Moscow, and there was a real-time tracker of how long it was going to take to get there, and there were attacks literally being made by the Russian military against it. That moment of jeopardy seemed real. In fact, I think probably was real.
It was so extraordinary. One of my favourite interviews of the past year was with an actor, Tom Hollander, who was playing a Russian in a play about Putin. And in real time, he said, he came out at half-time and the whole story of the invasion had turned around. By the time they did the evening one, they thought a full coup was underway with Prigozhin. And by the time they came out of the theatre afterwards, the whole thing had ended. And he said there's nothing quite like that sense of art borrowing from real life or real life borrowing from art. But it was a coup of 24 hours, not even.
Yeah, and of course, initially, Prigozhin sort of disappears. The odd video is released. Then we are told that there has been a rapprochement between Putin and Prigozhin and that they're all going to live happily ever after, although he's moved to Belarus now. Yes. But then he finds himself in St. Petersburg and is on a plane and oops, it just fell out of the sky.
Yeah.
And again, the price you pay for opposing Vladimir Putin laid bare in what was the murkiest of circumstances.
And again, if we think about whether or not to make it sound a bit trite with regards to him, but nonetheless, since we've got the theme, if Vladimir Putin's had a good or bad year, actually sat at the end of it rather than the middle, you'd probably say it's not been a bad year for Vladimir Putin. He's reasserted his own domestic political authority. And with regards to the war in Ukraine, he might have had a decent year this year. He might be about to have a very good year in 2024 because he's lasting the course. This, in a way, has been the year that the war in Ukraine ground to a halt. It's become a war of terrible attrition. The spring-summer offensive from Ukraine didn't really make very much progress. Zelensky is now probably having his toughest period since the beginning of the war. They're running out of men. There is the prospect of running out of munitions and arms from the West, and Trump could be on his way back.
Yeah, and political attrition. I think the trouble is that if you think about the protests that we saw in London and all over the capitals of Europe at the beginning of the war, the whole nation, the whole continent seemed to be behind Zelensky. And the longer that goes on, the more people get tired. And now you've got parts of America, parts of Congress who just don't really want to see their money going to Ukraine anymore. And it's getting much, much harder to get that sense of urgency. Look, Putin, we thought, was on death's door this time last year. Yeah. All those rumours were about him, having cancer and months to live. That's clearly not the case.
Look, there's been an absolute double whammy as far as Zelensky is concerned in Ukraine. The EU met just before Christmas to secure funding, a 5-year deal, and Viktor Orban blocked it, and Zelensky went to Washington to try and rattle the tin. And again, because of American political incapacity, that hasn't happened either. And so you have got Western Europe and America kind of going, sorry, we can't do that much at the moment to help. And that leaves Zelensky feeling pretty vulnerable and Putin feeling even more emboldened that you play the long game and you will win.
And brutally, we're running out of stuff to send. This is, again, one of the differences over the long term between Russia and Europe and the West, right, is that Russia, even though in some ways it's been completely cut off economically from the West, more or less, but it has moved to a full-on war economy. It's mobilised completely. Europe hasn't done that. The US hasn't done that. And so we're basically, as the longer it has gone on, we're competing with one arm tied behind our back, and so is Zelensky.
This is a hard corner turn to go from August to September and go from the death of Prigozhin to Russell Brand. But we're going to, because Russell Brand found himself in the headlines. He's never been far away from the headlines, but this time for all the wrong reasons, and allegations of sexual assault and rape that were brought to us by dispatches on Channel 4 and by the Sunday Times newspaper following enormously lengthy investigations. And I think it sort of says something about, is it Me Too? Is it about Russell Brand? Is it about his ability to try and reframe narratives and, just promote conspiracy theories so that you never actually address what it is that Russell Brand did or was alleged to have done, but you talk about the mainstream media being out to get him because of him having raised questions about, vaccines and the like.
And I think what we saw at the time was lots of people coming out and saying, oh my God, I always knew he was a sleazebag, I always knew he was disgusting, oh, how could you fall for Russell Brand, he had all that, the reputation. I interviewed him years ago, and I remember understanding exactly what it was, his sort of magnetism, that when he walks into a room and you suddenly feel incredibly listened to and incredibly special and slightly mesmerised, actually. And I think it's important to kind of understand that people, alleged sex offenders, alleged womanizers, often do have that extraordinary power of control and coercion. That's what makes them so good at what they're doing.
I remember when we put that clip out, some people sort of giving you flack for that, for sort of saying, oh, well, you're sort of giving him sort of credibility, talking about him being mesmerising, whatever. But it's completely opposite. I remember us talking about that in the sense that if you don't do that, if people don't say, oh, actually, you know what, yes, he's very charismatic, I sort of thought that at the time, what you're basically doing
is saying, you victim, you're an idiot.
You're an idiot, yeah. How could you possibly have fallen for that?
Whilst we're talking about Russell Brand's new incarnation as a Rumble host, perhaps pay a little bit of homage to our own version of that here, GB News, and some of the characters that have emerged or maybe submerged back into the woodwork from it. One was Lawrence Fox, who came out with the most extraordinary, foul, misogynist rant, and that was in September. Quick reminder here.
Show me a single self-respecting man that would like to climb into bed with that woman, ever. We need powerful, strong, amazing women who make great points for themselves. We don't need these sort of feminist 4.0. They're pathetic and embarrassing. Who'd want to shag that?
And I think how GB News develops, I think, is a theme that we're going to be watching carefully in 2024. Are we going to see a foxification of the media watch one set of channels, and if you're right wing, you're going to watch GB News or another set of channels, and the extent to which Ofcom is willing to hold the line over the standards in broadcasting that have actually made our broadcasting ecosystem so different and, dare I say it, so much better than what you have in the United States at the moment.
And if Ofcom do hold the line, but GB News refuse to pay the fines or refuse to take any notice, what happens to the system then?
Or they pay the fines and just think, price of doing business, price of publicity.
Oh,
we could be outrageous.
Off all the right people.
Exactly.
And if Labour get into government, that is something I know that they're having to think about even now, because obviously you could have the prospect of a Labour government tightening up the Ofcom regulations because they're unhappy with the way that something like GB News, the role that it's playing. And what does GB News say then? It's very Trump,
it's a witch hunt.
They're trying to clamp
Don't
down on freedom
down.
of expression,
Yeah.
all that sort of stuff. And this was basically part of the year as well when people started to think very seriously about what the Conservative Party might look like in opposition if they lose the next election, and whether there might be a radicalising effect there, which GB News might be part of. And it's definitely going to be a theme of 2024.
Oh, and we won an award.
Did we win an award?
Did we mention that?
Did we mention that?
I don't know.
Enough.
We're not known as being smug, of course. I'm sure that we wouldn't have
Daily
done.
podcast of the year. Podcast of the year.
Daily
that's
podcast.
us.
Daily podcast of the year.
We'll be
Probably
back.
podcast as well.
We'll be back with October in just a second.
This is The Newsagents.
So I think the history books will look at October 2023 and it will be Israel. It will be the appalling attack that Hamas launched against people who were just going about their lives in southern Israel. Ironically, a bunch of peaceniks and people who wanted to live in peace and harmony with the Palestinian community, who were murdered and slaughtered in the most brutal and horrific of circumstances, which kind of was shocking beyond belief. That there could be such an attack, that there could be such an intelligence failure on the part of Israel. And then there was a period where we kind of slightly held our breath and thought, what will the response be? And will it be a pinprick operation to try and take out Hamas? The IDF thought that wouldn't work. It was impossible. So what you've seen is a flattening of parts of Gaza that have been horrific, with enormously high civilian casualties, a massive polarisation of political debate in this country, around the world, a surge in anti-Semitism, a rise in Islamophobia, and the world feels a scarier place, I would say, at the end of it, when it's so hard. It's so hard to see how the pieces might fall in a constructive way at the end of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing. We are recording this at a time when there is no end in sight, where we don't know if the UN resolution is going to be backed by the US, where we don't know if Netanyahu is going to be warned off the current depth of his military strategy, which some would say has nothing to do with strategy and more to do with evisceration. And we don't know what next year is going to look like, whether it's going to bring more domestic terrorism as a result, whether it's going to bring more unsettlement throughout the Middle East, whether Hezbollah, whether Lebanon is going to become involved in this. I think it's a horrible way to enter 2024.
Yeah, and it has also had the effect as well of fracturing, if we go back to Ukraine, fracturing kind of any sort of momentum or emphasis on Ukraine. Yeah. It has drained American political influence. And I've been so struck by the votes of the UN, where Biden is kind of forced to either veto resolutions which are critical of Israel and forced to sort of associate himself with Bibi, even though he has no particular time for him, for Netanyahu. And yet you can see that the global south and the rest of the world, Russia is even sort of posing itself as a kind of sort of ally of peace, of someone who's trying to achieve peace in the Middle East. It's created all of these fractures and fissures with America, between America. And it's also, I think, exposed the extent to which American power is to some extent continuing to decline, because it just cannot corral its will.
Qatar is now the Middle East police.
Qatar, Egypt, you know, we're talking about who are the people who've got, you know, some kind of skin in the game there. America, sure, but there are others too, and it's a diminishing of American power that you're seeing. We've also got to talk about party conferences, which kind of, I know in the great geopolitical, strategic kind of sense of it, it may not be that important, but it was...
Stop it. They were a hoot.
They were a hoot.
They were living their best life.
I mean, honestly, the Tory party conference was the gift that kept on giving, wasn't it?
Stand up and fight. Because when you stand up and fight, the person beside you stands up and fights. And when our party stands up and fights, the nation stands up and fights. And when our nation stands up and fights, other nations stand up.
In case you hadn't noticed, that was Penny Mordaunt. I think rather better at holding a sword and saying nothing during a coronation.
Well, it's a good thing she didn't bring the sword on for that. That would have certainly
she could have slain
the
sword.
Where's your sword,
love? A bit of a different vibe. Stand up and fight.
It was also the party conference of Liz Truss. I remember the queues outside her speech.
Who would have saw that coming?
Exactly. I mean, Liz Truss in one wing of the conference hall, Nigel Farage in another wing of the conference hall, Suella having people removed from the conference because they disagreed with her views on trans rights and gay rights. And in the middle of it all, Rishi Sunak's momentous conference speech utterly lost. He did nothing in that speech except revoke HS2.
I think that conference speech, for me, sums up Sunak's wayward year, which is that he's had not a catastrophic year, but a pretty bad year, in the sense that what he needed to try and do this year was not only show that he could stabilise things, actually in some ways politically it hasn't felt all that stable, particularly on certain moments, but he had to try and show growth. He had to try and start to close the gap between Labour. That literally hasn't happened. The poll leader was saying in the last show is basically exactly the same. And that conference speech, where he basically trotted out this strategy which was to say, I'm different to the 30 years of Conservative and Labour Prime Ministers that have gone before. And I take long-term decisions, and the voters have got to try and follow this, I take long-term decisions that they would never take. And to show that for the long-term interests of the country. And to show that, I'm going to cancel a long-term infrastructure project. I'm going to introduce a reform to A-levels that won't come in until like the 2040s. And I can't even remember what the third one was.
Smoking is the one that's lasted. Let's see if that happens. That's impressive.
So blow us down, a few weeks later, he invites David Cameron back in as his foreign secretary.
Don't spoil it. That's November. That's November.
Can you have a spoiler for events that have passed 2 months ago? Is that possible?
Pre-spoiler.
But what he did, I mean, it was so funny because what he did was that he said in that conference speech that every Prime Minister since Thatcher, drawing the line because you can't say a word against the saintly Margaret Thatcher, has been a disaster. A few days later, I was at a breakfast where David Cameron was there, George Osborne was there, and a lot of the Cameroons, and they were absolutely spitting about how could Rishi Sunak have been so maladroit to do something as bad.
Twice in 1 year.
Oh, twice in 1 year. How could he be such an idiot? And they were furious.
About the cancellation of HS2.
Well, the cancellation of HS2, but also the cancellation of what they had done in government.
Yeah. I honestly think that the conference will be remembered for how utterly forgettable Rishi Sunak was at it. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I just mean there was no offering, there was no vision, and there was no bump. It's quite hard to end a conference as Prime Minister without seeing something rise a bit in the polls, unless you've clearly screwed it up. He didn't actually screw it up. He was just the most invisible person there. When we think back to it, we'll remember Suella, Liz Truss, Nigel Farage more than we will remember the Prime Minister himself.
I mean, he could say that, look, I end the year, inflation is now under 4%. I can start to sort of try and paint a picture for the economy for 24, that we've turned the corner, don't let Labour blow it, etc., etc. And that would be fine if that had been the message that they had hammered relentlessly all year long. And they haven't. He has been a trolley, veering from one strategy to the next and back again.
You can't
and
have
what
two
is the
trolleys.
message?
Sorry, you cannot have two ex-prime ministerial trolleys.
Well, they're
It's
different
ridiculous.
sorts of trolleys. I mean, you know, and I think, yeah, but in a way, I mean, Johnson at least...
He'd be more of a Geneva Airport luggage one.
Johnson at least, yeah. But, you know, Sunak is a guy who just simply... What is the message he's been trying to tell about this year? The truth he's been trying to tell about half a dozen different times. So it is no wonder that there's been no shift in the polls.
OK, so Lewis Goodall almost spoiled November by kind of
spoil events that have happened.
Pre-trailing. Well, there may be surprise for people who were
That'd
away.
be great. We've got some scoops for November that we didn't
You've
reveal.
been in a coma all year.
And you're
You
waking
woke
up and you're
on
listening
December
to us.
26th and they're like, I wonder what happened this year.
The doctors have handed you us.
Right.
Listen to the news
Exactly.
agents.
Here,
Catch up.
that'll fill you in.
But,
Cameron,
but the irony of it was just so fabulous that 2 weeks earlier, in his party conference speech, Rishi Sunak dishes every Prime Minister since Thatcher, and then it's a reshuffle day, and a car draws up in Downing Street. Sky News were live on the air at the time.
That's the security detail just opening the door for...
David Cameron? What? I was not expecting that.
So David Cameron steps back in as Foreign Secretary, and immediately it is seen as both a stroke of brilliance and as a potential danger, because people suddenly look round the cabinet table and remember exactly what an elected politician looks like, exactly what a statesman on the world stage looks like. And to be fair, Cameron hasn't spent much time sitting around. He's been off straight away. He was in Israel. He was in the Middle East. I think he was in China. He, has attended funerals of sort of Middle Eastern dignitaries.
Not the funerals, but...
Absolutely loving it. As I think I mentioned, I happen to know that Rishi Sunak wasn't the first Prime Minister to ask David Cameron back as his Foreign Secretary. Last time round, David Cameron thought it best to say no. Clearly wasn't a Prime Minister he thought he could work with. This time round, the fit worked. What does Cameron get out of it? Rewrites his legacy. Doesn't want to end it on, and then I lost the Brexit vote, whistled and went. Wants to rewrite it as the man who was brought in perhaps to try and solve Ukraine, perhaps to try and sort out part of the Middle East crisis, perhaps to put Britain on a better footing with Europe after the Brexit vote. And I guess that, in the next year, will be something really key. Will he actually be planning the election strategy that Rishi Sunak should be following? Who's listening to who here?
Or does he fancy maybe a tilt at the NATO Secretary General job at some point? And, he's obviously, he's loving basically being a latter-day Lord Carrington, about being a sort of foreign secretary in the Lords. It's all very pleasing.
Did you know there is also another Lord Cameron?
Is there?
In the Lords. There are two.
Do they ever
Lord
get
Camerons.
mixed up?
Well, early days.
Early
but,
days in the Lords, they are a bit confused, God love them.
No, and let's not play this down. In the chancelleries around the world, it's gone down very well.
Yeah.
That there is now a big figure in charge of British foreign policy. And although, yes, number 10 kind of dictates to a certain extent, David Cameron is not going to have dictated to him.
I bet if the Greek Prime Minister had been offered David Cameron instead of Oliver Dowden, he probably would have said thank you. Yes, please.
Again, that was the clumsiest bit of political handling by Rishi Sunak. When you're talking about just what was that for? What was that about? What did it achieve? Absolutely bugger all. And you just thought that, Cameron would have been a surer touch, is a surer touch. He has that to the manner-born air to him, that this all comes very naturally. And he's good at it.
The other thing that we've slightly forgotten about November is it was a month of a lot of good economic news for the government that somehow got completely lost. They really made strides into cutting down inflation. I know you can say that isn't down to the government, but it was still something that the government could say happened on its watch. Jeremy Hunt went on a tax-cutting spree. I know taxes are still high. They're the highest tax burden since the 1970s. But yet he has started to pledge more tax cuts. They started, in other words, to have a retail offering. And yet we ended the month completely dominated by the small boats question, Rwanda, and the departure of one certain Home Secretary, who went without too many tears from some quarters.
Oh, I don't know why Suella Braverman does anything. She doesn't know what she's talking about 9 times out of 10. She certainly doesn't know anything about her own department.
Does the Home Secretary have your confidence? Do you have confidence in her?
I want to have.
And I have to say I have been bitterly disappointed by some of the rhetoric coming out from government, in particular Suella Braverman, and shame on them.
We've seen a series of, interventions from her, which, have been in danger of crossing that line.
No, she's not fit to be Home Secretary.
I can't speak for why Suella Braverman says anything. I mean, I think she's probably chasing headlines and rather than dealing with the front line.
Did you think it was a mistake for the Prime Minister to invite her back in so shortly after having broken the ministerial code?
I do really think it was a mistake because it's led to all this controversy. And
Suella's trying to create headlines because she wants to be seen as the successor to Sunak. I do think she's guilty of hate speech.
This needs to come to a head. It's doing quite a lot of damage. We cannot have senior members of the cabinet on the face of it defying number 10 and plying her own agenda.
And that takes us neatly to December and the whole Rwanda policy, which initially seemed like it was set up to be a kind of, maybe this is one of the small things we could do that will be eye-catching, that will get the right-wing tabloids behind us, tough measures, we're going to send them to Rwanda, but has now become critical to Rishi Sunak and his political ability to be able to deliver this policy. When the Supreme Court has said, you must be joking, and the government is now introducing emergency legislation to say Rwanda is a safe place to go, and we don't know how this plays itself out.
No, and a huge part of Sunak's political credibility is now tied up and will be an early theme of 2024 in his ability or not to get at least one flight. And this is the kind of absurdity of British politics, right? It's like so much of his personal prestige is now tied up in getting one flight with maybe just one migrant over to Rwanda, and a huge amount, lots of briefings throughout the year, basically saying there's two things that Sunak's spending most of his time on. One is the economy, understandably, and the second is small boats, and trying to do something which we all know is basically, at the very best case scenario, going to result in a small number of people going over to Rwanda. But that, again, was his choice. It was his choice to put so much strategic emphasis throughout the year, not just say we're going to cut the numbers, not just say we're going to work with our partners to cut the numbers, to stop the boats, repeated ad nauseam every week, every month, and he hasn't managed to do so. He's paid a price for it, and it is going to be a big moment in the early part of next year when his latest emergency legislation comes back to the Commons and he's got to navigate it through the Conservative Parliamentary Party.
I'd also say, before we leave December, we should reflect that 2023 has been the year of some blockbuster TV-made inquiries. And the first is the Parliamentary Privileges Inquiry into Boris Johnson, where he actually had to face off those people who accused him, quite frankly, of being a liar, of deliberately misleading Parliament. That was the one that eventually brought him down. Yes, he'd resigned as an MP, but that was the moment that he essentially had to confront the fact that his own party had not just got rid of him, but had voted through the Privileges Committee, finding that he had deliberately, willfully misled Parliament. And the second, of course, is the COVID inquiry. And I don't mean to be sort of light-hearted when I say it's blockbuster, but it has been required viewing for the families of those clearly who lost people in COVID, and for all of us who've been trying to figure out the politics of what actually went on, what made up our government at the time. And I think it's revealed to us just how dysfunctional government was 2 years earlier.
We're going to be back after the break because our editor has just walked in and said we've each got to come up with our person of the year for 2023. So whilst this advert is playing, we'll be thinking.
Googling.
This is The Newsagents.
It is now time for the Newsagents Person of the Year. I think it's going to become bigger than Time Magazine's Person of the Year. Who cares about Taylor Swift anyway?
I suspect they're quite worried about it over at Time Warner.
I'm sure they are.
Very, very concerned.
Right,
rightly
Lewis,
so.
Go on, who are you going for?
Oh, well, I don't know. You know who I was going to actually have? What about Hugo Keith?
Hugo Keith, King's
Casey.
Counsel.
That's placing you very much on the side of we think he's doing a jolly good job, as against we think that he's leading the public inquiry.
Actually, you know what? Him and Lady Hallett, you know what? Actually, those two together, you know, they're getting so much just nonsense thrown at them by lots of people, lots of parts of the press who have a political agenda with regard to what they already think about COVID and what happened. And they are just trying to, and lots of political players as well, and they are trying to undermine it from the very beginning with a load of misinformation.
I think there'll be one phrase that he's particularly remembered for, and it might be this one.
You called ministers useless fuck pigs, morons, cunts, in emails and WhatsApps to your professional colleagues.
I think the reason that we like him is that there is occasional swearing on this podcast as well, and he has just given licence for us to reveal so many more swear words that we hadn't even thought about.
I don't think he's a swearer. I think he's just a repeater of obscenity. So he actually makes me feel a bit dirty, because I think one should really only swear when one is quoting others rather than just expleting. So no, I'm feeling chastened.
I never thought you would say that Hugo Keith made you feel dirty on this podcast.
Not in a good way.
But here we are.
So the breath of fresh air that I'm going to choose, and you're going to go, when I say his
Nadine
name.
Dorris, you love Nadine.
No.
He loves her.
No. Ange Postecoglou, the Tottenham manager.
Who? Oh, could have seen that coming.
Oh,
my God.
Robbie Williams has sung about him. Excuse to play Robbie Williams playing.
Is he the angel?
He's basically Ted Lasso, but he's the real life Ted Lasso.
He's Australian, he's down to earth. There is a good moral values as well to him. And
luckily he also manages Spurs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And through it we'll play the way we want to. With Big Edge past the Postecoglou, whether I'm right or wrong, it's Big Edge ball. So you can keep your
Okay, if I was to be really controversial, I go for my
here
person
we
of
go.
the year.
Here we go.
Which is someone we've already discussed because I think he's had a phenomenal year.
Putin?
Biden.
Farage.
Yeah.
I honestly think that if you were going to say where were his political fortunes in January and where are they now at the end of December, you'd have to be saying, well, what could happen?
You see,
if
I
the
was
Tories
joking
lose...
when I said John's person was going to be Mad Nads, but actually I was only a whisper away. I was literally a whisper away.
Did you just call her Mad Nads?
Am I not allowed to call her that?
I don't know. You just
she didn't like it, but yeah, well, we are where we are.
I mean,
It's Christmas. Merry Christmas, Nadine.
She was due to be on the podcast.
I think I just said Nads. So good they named her twice.
Anyway, in that spirit, Het Wilders. Het Wilders has a very good year.
Yeah.
And that is because 2024, it's going to be so many elections in 2024. 75% of the Democratic
Mate, you haven't come up with anybody
No,
yet.
I know, because I'm not just kind of going, let's find some wacko right-wing ideologue we can put on the front page of the newsagents. And everyone goes,
Do we have a paper now?
What a controversial choice. I mean, in that spirit, okay, I'm going to be really dull, but quite serious. Omid Jalili, I think, has been phenomenal because I only ever followed Omid as a comedian because he made me laugh. And I think there's probably a lot of people like me out there who just think, oh, he's a comedian who's made me laugh. But he has been relentless in pushing forward the Iranian women's cause to kind of idiot Westerners like me who wouldn't be following it in Farsi. And who came on the podcast was brilliant. I like him. I'd also say, where on earth is Navalny? And actually, for the sake of like keeping his name alive, I'm going to put Navalny out there as well, because he should have appeared in court. I mean, can you imagine being a Russian dissident at the time when the president isn't even concerned about you at all because he's fighting another war on another front and you're probably languishing in jail? And actually, if it wasn't for people like Navalny fighting the good fight, then the whole question of sort of what's actually happening in Russia would never be told and never known. So I know, it makes me a bit worthy, but I'm
they're
thinking,
definitely not right-wing ideologues.
They're
You're
not
right about
particularly,
that.
are they?
No, we've got that covered between me and
what
the
Maitlis
old man.
effortlessly did there was just to raise the tone, just to make
Oh,
us
I know,
feel a
I
bit.
know.
No, I'm
squalid
worried
and
that
stupid.
I've now walked into like Time Person of the Year stuff. That is it's more boring, isn't it?
No, boring, but we love you. Right, we'll see you next
Surely
year.
not a little
Matt
mention
Hancock.
for Matt Hancock?
No.
Guest of the year, maybe?
Guest of the year.
Yeah,
News
okay, you
agents?
can have guest of the year.
You can come
He's not
back
gonna
now.
have-
Him and Isabel.
He cannot have person of the year. We will see you in 2024. Thank you so much for being with us throughout the past year, for all your kind of fun
Presents,
and
cards,
love, engagement, all the rest of
questions,
it. It's been brilliant.
And
feedback.
occasional critical feedback.
Yeah.
Which we enjoy.
We didn't get any of that, did we? Was it just,
That was
no,
all
we
me.
didn't get any.
No,
Yeah,
of
just
course.
you.
Yeah.
And we will be back on January the 3rd.
Happy New Year. See
Happy
you then.
New Year.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.